Before dawn, the trap was already closing. If you value serious reporting, subscribe to my channel, John Lawrence, share this report, and leave your thoughts in the comments. I am John Lawrence, and tonight we follow a strike that was not built on speed alone, but on timing, deception, and pressure. At 05:15 local time, four Ukrainian FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles came in from the direction of the Sea of Azov and pushed toward Russian weapons and ammunition depots near Azovsky in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. On the Russian side, radar crews saw the first signs almost immediately. Signals appeared low over the water and moved straight toward the protected zone. Inside an S-400 battery, the first reaction was restrained. The tracks looked limited. The opening picture suggested a manageable intercept, but that calm would not last. These four missiles were not the whole raid. They were the first move in a layered attack built to stretch Russian defenses, break their rhythm, and force critical decisions under severe time pressure. The flamingos flew low and loose, almost ghost-like in the dim light above the sea. Their shape, materials, and flight profile reduced radar return. What appeared on the screen did not look like a clean strike package. It looked uncertain. And in modern air defense, uncertainty can be more dangerous than speed. The problem for Russian radar was never simple blindness. It was geometry, timing, and the limits of physics. The flamingos flew extremely low over the Sea of Azov, at times only a few hundred feet above the water. That mattered because low flight compresses the radar horizon. An early warning system can track high targets at great distance, but a cruise missile hugging the sea can remain hidden inside the curvature of the Earth until it is much closer. That was the opening advantage Ukraine chose to exploit. On the Russian screens, the returns did not form a stable picture. One sweep showed a contact, the next lost it. Then the signal returned slightly displaced, just enough to disrupt smooth tracking. The operators could tell something was coming. Velocity data suggested that clearly, but precise classification lagged behind. The FP-5 Flamingo had been built for exactly this kind of approach. Its navigation package allowed it to stay on course without depending too heavily on vulnerable external control. Its body used lightweight composite construction that helped keep the radar signature faint and fragmented. Combined with low altitude and speed, that made the missile difficult to sort cleanly from sea clutter. Russia could detect it in fragments, but fragments are not enough when the clock is already running. By the time the tracks became more solid, the threat was no longer theoretical. It was already approaching the final defensive window. At 0528, the Russian network finally classified the incoming targets more clearly. The faint signals over the sea were no longer random reflections. They were fast, low, and headed directly toward the Azovsky depot complex. The warning moved quickly to the S-400 battery near the coast. But by then, the real issue was no longer detection. It was time. The flamingos had appeared late, stayed low, and closed fast. That left the fire control crew with only a narrow interval to track, lock, and launch before the missiles entered the most dangerous zone. The S-400 turned its fire control radar toward the sea and began pulling the targets out of the clutter. One by one, the traces sharpened. What had looked like ghosts became a real attack line. The battery commander gave the order to fire. An interceptor launched and drove toward the lead missile. On paper, the S-400 was made for exactly this work. It carried long-range missiles, strong radar, and major engagement power. But paper advantages shrink quickly against a target flying just above the water. The engagement chain had to happen in seconds. Any delay in lock, any instability in illumination, any confusion from sea reflection could ruin the intercept. The first defensive shot exploded near the lead flamingo and tore into it with fragments. The missile lost stability and fell into the sea. One target was gone. Three were still coming. The destruction of the first flamingo did not restore control. It only proved how narrow the margin had become. The remaining missiles kept their heading and continued to cut down the distance to the depot. On Russian screens, the signals still faded at the edge of the tracking envelope. Another interceptor launched almost immediately. Then more defensive systems were pulled in. The S-350 and S-400 both began firing into the same compressed battle space, trying to sort targets, confirm assignments, and avoid duplication while seconds disappeared. That was the effect Ukraine wanted, not simply to force launches, but to force rushed launches under imperfect coordination. In the clutter over the sea, some interceptors chased a valid track. Others arrived where the target had just been. Fragments, jamming effects, and broken returns polluted the picture. Several flamingos were eventually destroyed, but the cost was significant. Expensive interceptors had been spent in a short burst, and the command network had lost tempo. That was the deeper objective of the opening layer. The four lead missiles were never meant to be judged only by whether they survived. They were there to trigger early fire, consume attention, and disrupt the handoff between Russian systems. And once that rhythm was broken, new signals began to appear. Some were slow, some were fast, some looked familiar, some did not. Only then did the Russian crews understand that the first four missiles had merely opened the gate. While Russian crews were still untangling the first wave, the main strike began to emerge. Two Storm Shadow cruise missiles, launched earlier along the same attack axis, now entered the picture. On the command screen, they appeared as cleaner, steadier tracks than the Flamingos. These were not decoys and not expendable probes. They were disciplined strike weapons, built to fly low, stay hard to detect, and hit fixed high-value targets with precision. Russian crews recognized them almost at once. Ever since Western cruise missiles entered the war, air defense operators had trained for this exact threat. But recognition does not guarantee interception. The Storm Shadows crossed the coastline at low altitude and moved toward the Azovsky depot at high subsonic speed. Their design made them dangerous in the final phase. They combined inertial guidance, satellite navigation, terrain following flight, and terminal matching against preloaded target data. They did not need to appear early to become lethal. They only needed to appear late enough to deny recovery from earlier mistakes, and that was exactly what happened. Behind them, dozens of other signals began filling the network. Slow propeller-driven targets and unclear returns crowded the tactical picture. Real missiles, cheap drones, and possible decoys pressed in together. Russia faced not a single raid, but a layered package built to overload classification and compress judgment. The Russian batteries reached the same conclusion. Whatever else was in the sky, the Storm Shadows had to be stopped first. The order came fast. Russian interceptors launched toward both cruise missiles. One of them, SS-1, was caught in the first defensive burst. Multiple detonations tore into the missile and destroyed it before it could press deeper inland. But SS-2 survived the initial engagement. Whether by luck, trajectory, or timing, it slipped through the first kill attempt. As interceptors closed, the missile dropped lower, shifted direction, and used terrain and clutter to complicate the final lock. One defensive warhead exploded close enough to damage it. Fragments ripped into the body and wounded the control surfaces. But the missile did not break apart. It stayed alive. That was the critical moment. A damaged Storm Shadow is still dangerous if its warhead remains intact and its guidance still functions. The flight computer compensated for the damage, recalculated the approach, and kept the missile on axis, even as speed fell and stability degraded. It was no longer perfect, but it was still moving toward the depot. For Russian defenders, that created a worse problem than a clean miss. A damaged missile can become unpredictable, slipping out of the intercept geometry while still carrying destructive power. Now the outer batteries were entering a reload cycle. Anything that survived into the next layer would fall to the systems deeper in the defense. And deeper inside the network, another commander was already watching a much larger problem take shape. About 15 miles southwest of the Azovsky depot, a Buk M3 battery had been monitoring the raid for several minutes. What its commander saw was deeply unsettling. Roughly 30 slow targets were approaching from the southwest at around 100 miles per hour. They were clearly propeller-driven. They did not look like the Storm Shadows. They did not look like the earlier Flamingos either. But they were numerous, low, and steady enough to become a serious threat. These were AQ-400 Scythe drones. On their own, each one carried a relatively small warhead. They were not built to destroy a hardened depot with a single blow. Their real value was different: quantity, endurance, cost. They were cheap enough to expend and numerous enough to force hard choices. The Buk M3 was optimized for low to medium altitude threats, but it did not have unlimited missiles, and it could not reload instantly under pressure. Fire too early, and valuable interceptors would be wasted on low cost drones. Wait too long, and the swarm could enter the danger zone together. Russian electronic warfare also came into play. A jamming system began pushing strong interference, aiming to disrupt navigation and scatter the drones off course. But the result was limited. The AQ-400s deviated only slightly. Their guidance could still lean on inertial navigation even when satellite quality fell. That meant the drones remained useful even under jamming, and that forced the Buk commander into the hardest kind of decision. He could see the targets clearly. The real question was which threat had to die first. By then, the whole pattern was finally visible. The opening flamingos had forced the S-400 and S-350 to react early and spend missiles. The Storm Shadows formed the main precision strike aimed directly at the depot. The AQ-400 swarm existed to prolong chaos, hold attention, and keep the defenders from resetting their rhythm. Then, as if to deepen the strain even further, surviving jet-powered tracks again became more prominent on the screen. The Buk M3 commander made his choice. Fast targets came first. Slower drones would have to wait. He ordered a launch against the higher value missile threat. Buk interceptors shot upward and closed quickly. One of the remaining fast moving attackers was struck hard. Fragments shredded the tail and broke its stability. The missile fell short and detonated near the shoreline. Another interceptor reached the engagement area moments later, but found only broken reflections and debris. The exchange showed the same pattern seen earlier. Russian defenses could still kill targets, but every engagement was costing time, missiles, and clarity. Meanwhile, the slower AQ-400 wave continued advancing. This was the central logic of the attack. No single layer had to succeed perfectly. Each layer only had to create enough pressure for the next layer to arrive under better conditions. The Russians were still shooting things down, yet the battlefield equation was turning against them. With every launch, they were getting closer to the point where the remaining interceptors would no longer match the number and type of threats still inbound. The Buk M3 now turned its attention to the AQ-400 drones. This was exactly the kind of phase that drains an air defense force. The targets were small, slow, and low. Their radar signature was weak, and their value was low compared to the missiles chasing them. But if ignored, they could still set fires, hit vehicles, and exploit whatever damage had already been done. The battery began firing. Several interceptors struck cleanly. Others missed, not because the missiles malfunctioned, but because proximity fuses and radar guidance become less reliable against light, low, weak return targets. One volley cut down part of the lead group, another took more, yet each success carried a cost. Expensive interceptors were being spent to kill cheap attack drones. The Buk crew was reducing the swarm, but not ending it. That is the hidden brutality of layered warfare. The goal is not simply to penetrate, it is to make every successful defense too expensive, too slow, and too exhausting to sustain. By this stage, the Russian side had already destroyed many of the incoming weapons, but the missile count in the launchers was falling, and the raid was not over. The AQ-400s had done their job even when they were shot down. They drew fire. They consumed attention. They bought time for the damaged Storm Shadow still flying deeper toward the depot. The battle was no longer about who had hit more targets. It was becoming a contest over who could still respond when the final gap opened. SS2 had been damaged, but it was still flying. That fact now overshadowed everything else. The missile had lost pieces along its route and suffered control damage, yet its guidance system kept it moving toward the target area. When satellite input weakened or became unreliable, inertial guidance carried more of the burden. Accuracy may have declined, but against a large ammunition depot, perfect precision was not required. The missile only needed to stay on the correct approach line. As it neared the final terrain edge, the Buk M3's engagement window narrowed to almost nothing. Minimum range, terrain masking, nearby vehicles, structures, and background clutter all worked in the missile's favor. If a target appears too late from behind cover, there may be no practical time left to complete another firing cycle. That was the moment the Russian commander faced. Behind him, surviving AQ-400 drones were still demanding missiles. Ahead of him, the damaged Storm Shadow slipped into the last defensive gap. On the screen, the icon moved with grim consistency. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden spiral into the ground. Instead, there was the worst possible outcome for the defenders: a wounded missile still under control. It skimmed low, crossed into the target coordinate zone, and prepared for its final approach. The last chance had nearly vanished, and in depot warfare, one surviving missile can be enough to change the entire operational picture on a front. At 06:17 local time, SS-2 reached the Azovsky Weapons and Ammunition Depot. It did not strike a minor object at the edge of the complex. It drove into the storage area itself. The penetrating warhead entered the structure and detonated inside. What followed was immediate and devastating. The first blast tore through steel doors, roofing, vehicles, and nearby ammunition clusters. Then came the second explosion, then another, then more, each deeper and heavier, as the depot began detonating from within. This is what makes ammunition sites so dangerous when they are hit correctly. The first strike is only the trigger. The stored shells, rockets, and supplies provide the rest. As secondary explosions spread through the depot, the surviving AQ-400 drones arrived at the final range. Their warheads were small compared with Storm Shadow, but under those conditions they did not need to be large. One hit near trucks, another struck close to internal supply points, others added fire exactly where fire was already spreading. In a burning depot, even a smaller detonation can become fuel for a wider chain reaction. By then, the meaning of the strike was unmistakable. Ukraine had used cheap targets to draw expensive missiles, layered faster weapons behind them, and timed the whole package so that Russian defenses never regained clean control of the battle. One gap remained. One missile survived, and one depot began to tear itself apart. The real significance of this strike was not only the explosion at Azovsky, it was the method behind it. Russia's defenses were not absent. They detected, engaged, and destroyed many incoming weapons. But the raid was designed so that successful interception still produced strategic exhaustion. Cheap drones consumed costly missiles. Early cruise missiles forced rushed decisions. A precision weapon then reached the weakest point at exactly the moment the network was most strained. The result was more than a single impact. It was a chain reaction that threatened ammunition flow to Russian forces on the southern front and forced supplies to be drawn from deeper in the rear. That is how modern attritional warfare often works, not by overwhelming every layer at once, but by making each layer pay too much before the decisive hit arrives. If you have followed this report to the end, subscribe to my channel, John Lawrence. Share this video with others who follow military and geopolitical analysis. And tell me in the comments what you believe mattered most here. Was it the Storm Shadow strike, the AQ-400 swarm, or the discipline of the entire layered operation? This battle offers no simple comfort, because once one side learns how to turn a few seconds of confusion into a depot-sized detonation, the next target is always waiting in the dark.